Hi everybody, it's Dr. Isom. I'm here to give you the last part of the Chapter 8 lecture on personality, anatomy, and physiology. And this part will cover the neurochemistry of personality and the conclusion of this lecture. You may recognize this picture. This is the picture of the four humors that were proposed by Hippocrates and then Galen to explain people of different temperament. Both of them proposed that there are individual differences that are related to the balance of humors or body fluids in the human body. Galen took this model and applied it towards temperament and suggested that excesses or deficiencies of these fluids are what determine our temperament or our personality traits. For example, the sanguine temperament type or humor type is the one that has too much blood, and if you have too much blood, then you tend to be a cheerful, optimistic type of person. Current thinking is the same idea, but with different fluids or biochemicals, in this case, neurochemicals. The difference now is that instead of bodily humors, neurotransmitters and hormones are investigated as related to personality traits. Specifically with neurotransmitters, how excesses and deficiencies of different neurotransmitters enhance or detract from neural communication across synapses for neurons in the brain. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that allow neurons to communicate with each other by secreting neurotransmitters into the synapse or the space between two neurons. That neurotransmitter can then send the message, either an excitatory or inhibitory message, onto the next neuron. Here's a little diagram of what I was talking about. So here we have two neurons. The one on the top is the presynaptic neuron because it's the pre, and here's the postsynaptic neuron, and here's the synapse. So this neuron would be communicating with this neuron at the bottom. And the way it communicates is by releasing neurotransmitters. These are chemical messengers that travel across the synapse, and then they bind with receptors on this postsynaptic neuron, and they either send a message that excites this neuron, potentially to cause it to communicate with another neuron, or that inhibits this neuron, or essentially sending the message, do not communicate the signal. When we're talking about the balance of neurochemicals or neurotransmitters, we're talking about the chemistry of the mind or the chemistry of the nervous system, because neurotransmitters are the chemicals that allow neurons to communicate. There's another neurochemical we're also going to talk about, and that is hormones. Hormones also affect the communication in the nervous system, but they do this not by being secreted between neurons. They do this by being secreted into the bloodstream, where they travel to different parts of the body and they influence communication. They can make receptors more sensitive or less sensitive to neurotransmitters, for example. Currently, they know of about 60 different neurochemicals that transmit information, and that includes neurotransmitters and hormones. But there are new ones that are being discovered every so often, so that number is definitely not a fixed amount. When we're thinking about how personality is related to neurotransmitters and neurochemicals, it's not just levels of neurotransmitters, excesses and deficiencies, the way Galen talked about it. There are many ways people can differ in their neural chemistry, and that is not only in the amount of neurotransmitters that are available to be released, but also in the number of receptors that are available on postsynaptic neurons. More receptors means that more communication can occur. Fewer receptors means that it's more difficult for neurons to communicate with each other. When neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, they are either swept away and flushed out with glial cells, or they can be taken back up and put back into these synaptic vesicles for later, and that's done by transporters. Or there's enzymes that are present in this fluid in the synapse that can break them down. People can also differ in the amount of those enzymes that are present to break down neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, once they're in the synapse, they will continue to hit those receptors and send that chemical message as long as they are there, or until they're broken down by those enzymes, or until they are flushed out of the synapse, or until they are brought back into the synaptic vesicles to be used again later. There's many ways that people differ in terms of the amount of neurotransmitters, the amount of receptors, but also in the amount of enzyme that is there to destroy neurotransmitters, and in the sensitivity of these little transporters that bring the neurotransmitter back into the synaptic vesicles. So there's many different variables involved, not just levels of neurotransmitters, but levels of other things, including enzymes that destroy neurotransmitters. I'm going to mention 3 neurotransmitters that are probably pretty familiar to you. And the first one is dopamine. Dopamine has been associated primarily with extroversion, but we know it's also been associated with another big 5 trait, and that's openness. It's involved when an individual is responding to some sort of a rewarding stimulus or some sort of a stimulus that can provide some sort of a positive reward or pleasant affect. It's been related to extroversion, also related to activity level and novelty seeking, seeking out new activities, motivation in general. It's been identified as possibly the main neurotransmitter that's involved in Gray's behavioral activation system that I talked about in the last lecture, and that's the system in the brain that is your approach system and the one that is associated with seeking reward. Levels of dopamine and sensitivity to dopamine has been related to the big 5 traits of extroversion and openness. The next neurotransmitter is serotonin, and serotonin plays a role in the inhibition of behavior. So it is something that keeps people from responding negatively with negative affect, anger, with excessive worrying. More serotonin allows more calm processing of negative and stressful situations. It prevents worrying. More serotonin is associated with being slower to anger and being less sensitive to the comments of other people. So when someone has developed an anxiety disorder, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, drugs that prevent serotonin from being taken back up into the synapse so they can stay in the synapse longer and keep communicating, are often the first line of defense. And one that you probably will be familiar with is Prozac. It's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So what it does is it prevents the transporters that I was talking about before, these little transporters here that sit on the presynaptic neuron. Once serotonin is released into the synapse, these transporters pull them back up so that they can be used later. If you're taking a drug that's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor like Prozac or Lexapro, there are many out there on the market, it stops these transporters from doing their job, bringing that serotonin back in. So what it does is it allows that serotonin to remain in the synapse longer, and the longer it's there, the more it can cross over and hit those receptors and communicate. In this case, it would be an inhibitory message, don't fire. So this would be the don't get angry excessively, don't worry, don't be oversensitive. So the physical effect of SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac is that it increases serotonin levels in the synapse. And they have been shown to be very effective in treating anxiety and in depression for some people. And they've also, as Funder mentioned in the textbook, they've also been taken by people who don't have identified depression or anxiety disorders. And what they do is reduce the amount of negative affect, they reduce oversensitivity. Because people aren't worried about what other people are thinking, they're able to function better and be more productive. So the question was raised by Funder, are these appropriate drugs for people who are not suffering from depression and anxiety? Are they kind of like plastic surgery for personality? I think that's a good question. There are side effects, though, to SSRIs. Some people argue that not only does it take the edge off negative emotions, but it can also dampen your ability to experience positive emotions as well. They're not a wonder drug by any means, but they are very helpful for people who have suffered from anxiety and depression. In general, the connection between serotonin and personality is that higher levels of serotonin have been related to higher levels of agreeableness, higher levels of conscientiousness, and then obviously less neuroticism, less anger, less negative affect, less worry. The last neurotransmitter that I'm going to mention is norepinephrine. And this is a neurotransmitter that is part of the initial phase of the stress response or the fight or flight response. So it is what's released by your nerve endings right when you experience a fight or flight stress response. So if you step out into the street and you weren't paying attention and you all of a sudden hear a car horn honking and you have to jump back up on the curb really quick to prevent getting hit by a car. That surge of energy that you feel, that's the result of norepinephrine being released by nerve endings so that you can quickly get off the street and get back onto the curb to safety. So that's one of the roles that norepinephrine plays. It also is involved in maintaining general alertness and arousal and vigilance. If you don't have enough norepinephrine, you are probably going to suffer from a little bit of distractibility or inattention. So that's another thing that it's been related to. Moving from neurotransmitters to hormones, there have been several hormones that have been studied. One of them is cortisol. So speaking of the fight or flight response, the first part of the fight or flight response is that release of norepinephrine. But the second part involves the release of hormones like cortisol. Cortisol is released and it does a similar thing to what norepinephrine and adrenaline do. Adrenaline is also released in that second phase of the fight or flight response. It increases vigilance. It increases your ability to respond to whatever that stressor is. There have been studies that have shown that people who experience chronic stress, who experience high levels of anxiety on a regular basis and depression, have chronically high levels of cortisol, probably because that fight or flight response, that stress response, is constantly or frequently being activated by their environment and their circumstances. So this is something that can happen with cortisol. If you have too high of levels, it can be a problem because high cortisol also is related to increase in heart disease. It also causes weight gain because one of the things it does is it tries to store sugar so that you'll have it, make sure that you can fight off whatever the stressful event or stimulus is that you have to respond to. One other thing that has been noticed with cortisol in research is that often you'll have somebody after prolonged periods of extreme stress, such as individuals who've suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, you'll see low levels of cortisol. And this seems to be sort of a paradoxical response. But what ends up happening is the person's levels of cortisol are so low that it prevents them from responding to anxious situations or stressful situations, and can even be related to their being attracted to activities that you would call sensation seeking, things that are maybe risky, physically risky, like jumping out of an airplane or parasailing, that type of thing, speeding, illicit drug use. Another one of the hormones that's released in response to stress, and these are corticosteroids. Cortisol is a corticosteroid, and so is oxytocin. Oxytocin. It is one that actually has been associated with promoting nurturing and being sociable, and it also causes feelings of relaxation and fear reduction. Now, what's interesting is that if you think about the fight or flight response, we often talk about it prepares you to fight off whatever the stressor is that you're faced with, or to run really quickly from that stressor. The fight or flight response also releases this oxytocin. And one of the things that is interesting about this is that people have hypothesized that for women, oxytocin, rather than increasing our ability to fight or flight, oxytocin has this other response called the tend and befriend. And so if you think about women who are often the caregivers, if they're faced with a situation like fight or flight, this hormone allows them to actually tend to, if they have small children, the vulnerable ones, and then to seek support from people around them because, you know, there's strength in numbers, there's strength in groups. If you turn to that social group, then you'll have more protection than if you're facing whatever that threat is alone. So oxytocin is something that has been associated with, for women anyway, a way to respond to threat that isn't fight or flight. Whereas for men, they tend to respond with the traditional fight or flight. Oxytocin also decreases anxiety. It has been shown to increase attachment between mothers and children. Oxytocin is also the one hormone that has been shown to actually repair heart muscle. And so it's led some researchers to advise that we need to get as many hugs and as much time petting your dogs and your cats and your pets, because those are also circumstances that cause the secretion or the release of oxytocin, other than stressful situations in the fight or flight response. Okay, so I mentioned this, how oxytocin may be the reason why women sometimes respond differently to stress in a fight or flight situation than males do. Some research has suggested that the reason why oxytocin doesn't work with males is that their levels of testosterone, which are frequently 8 to 10 times higher in males than females may block the effect of oxytocin, this tend and befriend effect in oxytocin. But that is definitely not a firm conclusion. That is something that is still being tested quite a bit. Also, oxytocin has been associated with higher levels of empathy, particularly for women. Let's talk about testosterone. Now, I mentioned that the concentration in men is about 8 to 10 times higher than in women. And higher levels have been linked to lots of things, including aggression and dominance, but also it's been linked to having greater confidence and feeling more powerful. There's a study by, I believe it's Amy Cuddy. She discusses how our body positions, particularly if we strike a position of power, like Wonder Woman, or stretching ourselves out, taking up a lot of space, is associated with the secretion of higher levels of testosterone. It definitely has been shown to play a role in aggression, as I mentioned before, but also impulsivity and sexual behavior, and in inhibition or the lack thereof of aggression. Some have connected it with criminal behaviors, even loneliness, but the relations between testosterone and behavior are definitely not clear-cut, because you can have men with very high levels of testosterone that don't show any of these, or very little of these traits, like the high levels of aggression or criminal behavior or high levels of impulsivity. So it's not a very clear relationship. And it's also something that is not just a one-way thing, because there are studies that show that people who are on winning teams, after they win a game, then their testosterone levels go up compared to the losers. And even people that are fans of a winning team that aren't even involved in the whole competition, when their team wins, their testosterone levels also go up. So we don't know whether it's the fact that if you have a lot of testosterone, you're going to be dominant and have a lot of confidence and be aggressive, or if having a lot of confidence and being dominant and aggressive and competitive and winning raises your testosterone levels. But the truth is, it's probably both. Probably both can affect your testosterone level. It's not definitely a one-way causal arrow. So Funder talks about testosterone and mentions estrogen, but doesn't really talk too much about estrogen. So I thought I would add a little bit more about this hormone that's been studied by Helen Fisher. She hasn't done neurochemical studies on estrogen, but she is a sociologist, anthropologist, who has studied the personality and behavioral associations with having high levels of estrogen, either currently or high levels of estrogen prenatally. And she finds that estrogen, higher levels of estrogen, are related to being more compassionate, having more intuition, having higher verbal skills, being more nurturing, more altruistic, and more broad-minded or idealistic. She also relates having higher levels of estrogen with higher empathy and more pro-social behavior. Another thing that she points out, and this is from research, not that she did, but research that she summarized, and that's that higher levels of estrogen are also associated not only with higher verbal abilities, but also a better ability to recognize the emotions of faces on other people, and also nonverbal cues. So higher levels of emotional intelligence. So how do you know whether you're one of those people who has either higher levels of estrogen or were exposed to higher levels of estrogen prenatally? Well, there is some research that suggests that you can look at the difference between the length of your index finger and your ring finger. And I have a little diagram here if you want to try it out. But basically what you do is you identify whether your ring finger is longer than your index finger. So this is digit span or digit length. If your ring finger is longer than your index finger, then that means that you probably were not exposed to as much estrogen as somebody whose index finger is longer than your ring finger. So that's the case over here. Index finger is longer than the ring finger. This is typical for women. This is the hypothesis anyway, that people with this pattern of having the index finger longer than the ring finger were exposed to more estrogen prenatally, and that influenced not only the development of their brain and possibly the development of greater nurturance and better verbal abilities, but also differences in the length of these digits. So the reason why Helen Fisher has studied this is because she created a personality test, and it's a typology test, so not my favorite, but she has done quite a bit of research on it. And she says she is associating levels of hormones like estrogen, testosterone, for example, with different personality characteristics. So if you're interested in taking her test, there is a link, and I have the link in these PowerPoint slides. If you'd like to go on and see how you measure up on her personality test, maybe you took a look at your fingers and you realize that maybe your index finger is shorter than your ring finger or vice versa, and you're curious as to what Helen Fisher says about that and your personality, there's a chance to take a look. Lastly, the Big Five and functioning of the brain and how that's related to the Big Five. Now, this isn't necessarily neurochemistry. This is where I'm just wanting to sum up some of the research and some of the things in this chapter. It turns out that if you look at the 5 factors, remember I said they're all orthogonal, and so they're uncorrelated. Well, there have been some researchers that have done a factor analysis on the 5 factors, and 2, in fact, have decided that you can take the 5 factors and they actually will boil down into 2 factors. And so what you end up with is these 2 meta traits, and they are stability. Stability is one of the meta traits. On stability, the Big 5 factors of agreeableness, neuroticism, and conscientiousness load. The other meta trait is plasticity, and openness and extroversion, the remaining 2 5 factors, are correlated with that meta trait. And so if you think about what we just talked about in terms of neurotransmitters, you might notice that the first 2 neurotransmitters that I talked about, dopamine and serotonin, may be related to these 2 meta traits. Because remember I said that levels of dopamine are associated with openness and extroversion. Increases in dopamine are associated with increased openness and increased extroversion. And then the other neurotransmitter that was related particularly to neuroticism, but also conscientiousness and agreeableness, is serotonin. So it may be that in terms of personality, the 2 neurochemicals that are the most telling or the most correlated with our personality, the most associated with our personality, may be serotonin and dopamine, and they actually map quite nicely onto these 2 meta traits of stability and plasticity, in that stability includes the 5 factors of agreeableness, neuroticism, and conscientiousness, and those are all affiliated with levels of serotonin, whereas the other meta trait, plasticity, in which openness and extroversion are highly correlated with it or map onto it, those are associated with higher levels of dopamine. So it may be that dopamine and serotonin are driving forces or very important factors in our 5 factor traits. And as I was saying, so there's evidence that plasticity traits, or the plasticity meta trait, is associated with levels of dopamine, and the stability trait is associated with levels of serotonin. He also demonstrates, and you'll see this in this picture here, this infographic with different images, that 4 of the 5 factors are associated with the size of different structures in the human brain. And you'll see that extroversion is associated with frontal lobe size, and that's not surprising considering there is evidence that extroversion is associated with functioning of the frontal lobes. Also, agreeableness is associated with activity in the temporal lobes. Same thing with neuroticism. You would expect that neuroticism would be associated with the size of the amygdala and probably the hippocampus, because the hippocampus is involved in emotional memories. So there are some definite connections between the 5 factors and different structures in the brain. Remember Elliot. Elliot suffered from the tumor in the midline in the medial frontal lobe, and when that part of the brain was damaged, when the tumor was removed, he had a difficult time with emotional judgment and moral decision making and reasoning. You would expect then that the size of this structure, the middle frontal gyrus that is in the medial frontal lobe, would be associated with conscientiousness. Those are the things that he suffered from, the inability to understand the consequences of his actions and understand emotional and moral judgments. Those are parts of the conscientiousness trait. So there definitely are some intuitive links between what we know about personality, what we know about brain structures, and then the size of these brain structures that DeYoung reports in his study. Let's talk about that a little bit more, though. I mean, it's really tempting to go through all these and be able to explain all of individual differences, all of personality, and all of the personality characteristics by the size of different structures in the brain, or the functioning, or the activity, or levels of dopamine or serotonin. And that idea, being able to reduce behaviors like that, complex behaviors, to individual parts, is something called reductionism. And it is tempting because it would really simplify everything. It would make it so that, oh yeah, that person is too impulsive. Well, they just have too much dopamine. But it's more complicated than that. That is a much too simplistic way of thinking about human behavior. Here's this little diagram of the car. You can study these individual parts of the car just like we study the individual structures in the brain. But just because you know that the steering wheel is really influential, for example, in turning the car, that doesn't mean that's the only part of the car that's involved when you turn, right? You have to be able to turn, I don't know what this part is here where the steering wheel attaches, but you have to be able to turn the axle, and the wheels need to be able to turn, and you need to have gas in the engine to be able to power the car to be able to turn, because even if you turn the steering wheel, if you're not moving, it's not going to turn the car. So reductionism isn't really the way to understand the complexity of human behavior and personality. We really need to have an understanding of how all of those parts work together to produce behavior. And more than that, for the most part, the car, once you get the car, it starts to deteriorate over time, but it doesn't change. It doesn't adapt like the brain does. We know the brain, not only is it a complex system that's reliant on multiple parts simultaneously, but it also is constantly changing and adapting. Unless you don't have a pulse, your brain is different today than it was yesterday. The fact that we're all home doing homeschooling and managing childcare while we're trying to finish school or teach and do work, all of those things are challenges that our brain is adapting to. Your brain has changed physically as a result of all of the things that you've had to face just in the last couple of weeks. And you will be facing, we don't know how much longer that we'll be doing this. Once our environment changes again, our brain will also change again to adapt to new circumstances, because the brain is a system that's always changing. So then what we can say is that personality is a cause of our behavior, and the brain is a cause of our behavior, but it's also an effect, because the things that we do then go back and change the physical structure of the brain. What I'm talking about here is neuroplasticity. And I have a little diagram here. It's kind of simplistic, but neuroplasticity works like this. Our brain is arranged in circuits, right? And there are many, many neurons, 85 to 100 billion neurons. This is what happens. You have a new thought or a feeling or an action. I'm having to teach with Zoom. You're having to learn with Zoom. This is causing different neurons in our brains to fire. Okay, but we're doing this over and over and over again. And every time that we do this new behavior or experience this new feeling or have this new thought, the connections in the brain are strengthened. Those structural connections between these circuits are strengthened every time that signal travels through those neurons with repetition over and over and over again. The signal between those neurons is strengthened. So we're developing more pathways, and pathways that signals will function more easily as we continue to repeat whatever this behavior is, this feeling or this thought. That repeated activation of that neural circuit enhances the connections and then makes it easier to fire. But what happens is it actually changes the physical structure of the brain. It changes not only the size, because volume increases when these connections increase, but it also increases the activity in these circuits. So things that we measured with our research methods, the MRI, the CT, the functional MRI, what you may have measured one day might be totally different later on, because our brains are rapidly changing and adapting. So we need to think about this not only in terms of thinking about the brain and behavior and personality as being part of the firing of circuits and the firing of systems, but that those firings of circuits and systems can also change the brain physically through neuroplasticity. Not only can our behavior change our brain, or our thinking and our feelings change our brain, but drugs like Prozac can also do that. By changing the firing of neurons in the brain, they also can create neuroplastic changes. There's many ways that our brain is constantly changing and adapting. Another one of those things that can change the connections in the brain is psychotherapy. When you engage in psychotherapy, and a good therapist will help you reframe whatever the situation is that's causing distress, maybe depression and anxiety, the new connections that you form, the new perspective that you're taking, causes new neurons to fire in a different circuit. And the more you practice that, the more you repeat that, the stronger that circuit becomes. So even psychotherapy can change the physical structure of the brain. So when we talk about understanding how the brain works, having a general understanding of how the brain functions can help us understand personality, but we also need to understand how our behavior and our personality change the function and the structure of the brain as well, so that we have a much better understanding of the complexity that's involved in producing human behavior. So hopefully I didn't make that overly complicated, but things that you need to remember are that our brain is plastic and that it is constantly changing and adapting, that we need to think about personality and behavior as being a function of systems and circuits of neurons rather than individual structures in the brain. And we need to avoid thinking about the causes of our behavior and the influences in our personality as being related to levels of maybe just one neurotransmitter or two neurotransmitters, but rather as part of a more complex system. And that is it for chapter 8.